So, Uncle, before we talk about the architecture of Adabraka with the advent of the black bourgeoisie, you know, taking that area as their home, let's talk a little bit still about Ridge. A lot of the houses you've described, they're also raised on, almost on stilts, yes, if you could call them that.
When they were studying the epistemology, the disease, how diseases are spread, they realized that this was a scientific inquiry, and they looked at it from different areas. They inherited from European medical theory two ideas about the spreading of disease. One was that fresh air blows away disease. The second one was that sunshine kills the microbes, whatever. So, if we look at those properties, the lawn is big and the house sits on it in order to allow air to flow. The houses are raised to allow the air to flow under the houses and around it, to ensure that the diseases are swept away. There are the neem trees that sit on the periphery of the lot as a guard against invading mosquitoes. That's how that works.
Yeah. So let's go back to Adabraka. So the black bourgeoisie, yes, right?
The black bourgeoisie who were living in Jamestown, the doctors and the lawyers. Don't forget, because the British were settled first in Jamestown, that was British Accra, as opposed to
British Accra.
Yes, as opposed to Dutch Accra and Danish Accra. The British were in Jamestown. So much of their early education to the black bourgeoisie went to girls living in Jamestown. So those were where we got our first doctors and lawyers from. And they came back and got into the professions. They obviously were not too happy about being closed in with the Africans. They saw themselves as equal to, even superior to the whites.
As indeed, many of them are also better educated than the whites who were here.
So when they saw the whites fleeing, they also decided to follow suit. Adabraka at that time had been prepared as the dormitory for the servants of the Europeans living in Ridge, so that they wouldn't have to go too far from their master's house. But as it turned out, it was easier for them to stay in that small, cramped boys' quarters at the corner than to go down to Adabraka. So the black bourgeoisie moved there. And of course, it became a Christian community. The first community that was not under native authority. So you were not allowed more than one wife. Your kids have to go to school. There was some restriction on noise you could make. No. Besides which, your neighbors all wanted to be very proper anyway. So it wasn't like they had to fight very hard. So that's what Adabraka was like. And the houses were built to show those white people over there that the Africans here can live better than they can. So if you look at the houses at Adabraka, they were magnificent houses. I don't know how well you know, but I grew up there and I know it. Yeah? Magnificent houses.
And I mean, we also know that at some point we even had a lot of the popular political names playing on those Adabraka streets.
Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. The rest, they all lived in that area.
Okay, so Uncle Nat, so we've of course, so we've established, this architectural history for Ridge and Adabraka. I want us to come back to Jamestown. Now, particularly because when you are moving from from the Kolebu area, if you're going to negotiate a turn to join the high streets, take a left to come onto the main Jamestown road, you see buildings that look like they could be warehouses.
Okay.
What's the history of those buildings?
After the slave trade ended in 1851, it was a very difficult transition economically because slave trade employed a lot of people who went to capture slaves, people who walked with the slaves down to the towns, people who guarded the slaves. And suddenly, it was illegal. At first, they tried to use other routes, such as Togo or Abidjan, Ivory Coast, but it was difficult. So, they had to put an end. But then you had to find an alternate economy.
Because a lot of them were now stuck here, as it were.
It so happened that the cars had been invented. And cars needed rubber ties to roll on. And somebody, I suppose, Michelin, had invented the rubber tie.
The popular Michelin.
Yes. So they had an answer. Then they found out that they could actually grow rubber here. If you go from Accra towards Ivory Coast, you go through huge plantations of rubber. So that's how that business came up. That's what I was going to get to. Palm oil succeeded cocoa as an export product. They needed to export it out of the country. And of course, at that time, Jamestown Harbor, the right here, was the main harbor of Accra. So those huge warehouses were built to accommodate those barrels of palm oil. They were rolled down to Accra from the hinterlands. There were no roads. So you have a bunch of men rolling it all the way until they got here. Accra grew because of a confluence of interests. One of the most significant people who influenced the growth of Accra was Sir Guggisberg, who was governor of the Gold Coast from 1917 to 1919 to 1927, I think. And he built Achimota Secondary School. He built Kolebu Hospital. He built the port at Takoradi. And he started the railroads. He was a far-seeing visionary who saw that the European domination of Africa would come to an end sooner than later. And when that happens, the Europeans will have to leave and let the Africans run their own affairs. So instead of concentrating on things that can be taken out immediately, he concentrated on long-term investment.
And of course that included buildings, architecture.
He believed that we needed an educated elite. I mean, after all, he was British, and he had been bred in the idea that you need an elite. Hence Achimota. And it was designed as a typical upper-class English high school with all that goes with it. Now, the advantage that Achimota brought architecturally is that it introduced new concepts of construction. Up till then, construction had been mud brick and wood. Achimota brought the idea of concrete, the use of concrete and slate roofs. And it lasted for a very long time, still holding its own.
Up until now, we still use concrete.
And that's Guggisberg's contribution to this place. There were several others like him.
Akuna, I'm also particularly interested in a building like the Holy Spirit Cathedral. Yes.
That's the Catholic one?
Yes. Just at the the intersection that would lead, so if you're not going to Adabraka, you're going to Asylum down.
Yeah. Holy Spirit Cathedral was opened in 1957. What's interesting about Holy Spirit Cathedral is that it was opened during the year that the Pope issued a new dicta inside. They have a name for it. You can find out. Yes. In which he literally changed the mode of Catholic worship. Before then, the priest stood with his back to the congregation and did what he had to do. It was between the priest and the cross. He changed it around for the priest to face the congregation. I'm not a Catholic. I'm not an expert in the arcana of Catholic worship. But I know that his reign made a huge difference in the architecture, because previously to that, the church emphasized the mystery of the Spirit. Hence, Latin. Hence the incense and the rest of it, to emphasize the separation between mortals and the immortal. And he turned this around. So Holy Spirit Cathedral was one of the first Catholic cathedrals in the world that was designed specifically to celebrate a new union between God and man.
And it was built also, incidentally, in 1957.
Oh, yes.
Yes. So for us, that was also very iconic.
Indeed it is. I remember when it was opened, and it was quite a big deal.
Prior to that, architecture of other places of worship, and particularly churches, what was that like? Of course, we can talk about the Salem communities, for example. What was that kind of architecture, fashioned after? What influenced it in Accra?
Well, the history of church architecture is a rather convoluted one, and because churches come from so many different inspirations. Before Guggisberg, who retired in 1927, Accra was hemmed in by the Korle Lagoon. The Ghans had a phobia about crossing the Korle and Udo River and all that. But the infrastructure he did, the bridges he built over the lagoons and the lakes, allowed the city to expand in. And then his construction of Achimota opened the city out. So if anything, Guggisberg helped expand the city.
The city of Accra as we know it today.
He did. In 1939, there was a major earthquake in Accra. Accra was not unused to earthquakes, but that was a particularly brutal one. And much of where we are sitting here were literally obliterated. The government had to come to its rescue.
So, ladies and gentlemen, let me just remind you again that we're at Jamestown, particularly where we are is the Deo Gratis Studio, established in 1922, oldest photo studio in Ghana, really.